Political institutions. In its long history, Nigeria has experienced many different regime types. In its pre-colonial days, the regime type varied from one area to another. In the north and west, well-developed large states with hereditary monarchs developed. And in the south, small communal kinship-based rule predominated. The Hausa people in the west were organized into powerful trading city-states. Regime type changed dramatically with colonization, with the British imposition of indirect rule. Where chiefs did not exist, the British created them. An authoritarian rule under British direction was well developed by the mid-20th century. Authoritarian rule has continued into the independence era, when a military-style regime emerged by 1966. Today, the government structure is formally federalist and democratic, but it is not generally operated as such. The British controlled economic life during the colonial era, and the economy remains under state control today. However, international factors have forced Nigeria to turn to supranational organizations, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, for help in restructuring the economy. Linkage institutions. Because Nigeria's efforts to democratize are so far incomplete, linkage institutions in general are both newly developed and highly fluid. However, Nigerian citizens have organized in a number of ways with varying degrees of impact on Nigerian politics. Political parties. Predictably, political parties in Nigeria have almost always been regionally and ethnically based. Unlike Mexico, Nigeria did not develop a one-party system in the 20th century that contributed to political stability. Instead, Nigeria's extreme factionalism led to the development of so many parties that it was almost impossible to create a coherent party system. The resulting multi-party system was reinforced and deepened ethnic and religious cleavages. Parties also form around powerful individuals, and so tend to fade with leadership changes. Parties have appeared, disappeared, and reorganized frequently. However, in the election of 2015, these two parties supported major presidential candidates. The People's Democratic Party, PDP. This is one of the better established parties, having run candidates for office as early as 1998. The PDP is the party of Olusegun Obasanjo, and in 2003 he received about 62% of the vote for president. In 2007, amidst widespread fraud, Umaru Yar'Adua received almost 70% of the vote. The party also gained the overwhelming majority in the National Assembly, and most of the governors elected were candidates of the PDP. However, because the elections were fraudulent, it is very difficult to know how much real support the PDP actually has. Obasanjo is a Christian in Yoruba from the south, and the party won elections throughout the country. Yar'Adua was a Muslim from the north, and when he died in 2010, his vice president, Goodluck Jonathan, a southern Christian, took over as acting president. And in 2011, Jonathan was elected president in his own right. But he lost the 2015 election to All Progressive Congress candidate Muhammadu Buhari. All Progressive Congress. Prior to the election, the All Progressive Congress was formed as an alliance of four opposition parties: the Action Congress of Nigeria, the Congress for Progressive Change, and the All Nigeria People's Party, and the All Progressive Grand Alliance. In primaries held in December 2014, Muhammadu Buhari won the new party's candidacy for president and eventually won the election. One trend since 1999 is for parties to lose their regional base and to draw support from many parts of the country. The PDP originated in the Muslim north, but deliberately ran Obasanjo, a Christian Yoruba from the south, as its candidate in 1999 and 2003. As a result, it became the dominant party. However, all three elections before 2011 were fraudulent, and violence levels were high enough, more than 200 people were killed in protests surrounding the 2007 elections, that it was difficult for PDP to claim legitimacy. Since the 2011 elections were much cleaner, the PDP's legitimacy increased, although the party was criticized for not running a Muslim from the north, since Jonathan, a southern Christian, had been president since 2010. In 2015, the All Progressive Congress made big inroads into the south, ensuring the election of Buhari as president. A flurry of party registrations with the Independent National Election Commission, INEC, followed the death of President Abacha in 1998. In order to run candidates for the legislative and presidential elections of 1999, a party had to qualify by earning at least 5% of the vote in 2/3 of the states in the December 1998 local elections. This practice effectively cut the number of parties running to 3, and also limited the eligible parties to 5 in the presidential election of 2003. The INEC was widely accused of corruption in the election of 2007 and of complying with President Obasanjo's desire to keep Vice President Abubakar from running for the presidency. The INEC left his name off the list of official candidates, but his disqualification was overturned by the Supreme Court. Before the election of 2011, President Jonathan asked Atahiru Jega, a respected academic, to head the INEC, and Jega drew up a new voter registration, removing names that were obviously fraudulent. For example, a village in Kaduna State that reported 50,000 votes for the PDP in 2007 was shown to contain only 4,000 voters. He also had ballot papers printed abroad to limit their supply, though a later delivery forced a one-week delay in legislative, gubernatorial, and presidential elections. Jega also supervised a switch to the open secret ballot system. Voters were asked to register at polling stations on Election Day, and they were encouraged to stay there until results were posted locally in order to verify them and to prevent multiple voting. These reforms contributed to a relatively fair and open elections in 2011 and 2015, the first in Nigeria's recent history. Elections and electoral procedures. Citizens vote for candidates on three levels: local, state, and national. On the national level, they vote for the president, representatives to the House of Representatives, and senators for their states. National elections. Presidential elections. The first presidential election after the annulled election of 1993 took place in 1999, followed by a second election in 2003. If a presidential candidate does not receive an outright majority, a second ballot election may take place. A candidate won in the first round for the first time in 2011, when Goodluck Jonathan won almost 59% of the vote. An unusual requirement, however, reflects Nigeria's attempt to unite its people. A president also must receive at least 25% of all the votes cast in 2/3 of the states. In other words, a purely regional candidate cannot win the presidency. The requirement also indicates how difficult unification has been for Nigeria since independence in 1960. Legislative elections. The Senate has 109 senators, 3 from each of the 36 states, and 1 from the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja. They are elected by direct popular vote. The 360 members of the House of Representatives are elected from single-member districts by plurality vote. No runoffs take place for these seats. The result in both houses is regional representation with a wide array of ethnicities that try to form coalitions, even though legislative policy-making power is very weak anyway. Currently, the PDP holds a majority in both houses, although several other parties are represented. Election fraud. Many observers believe that Nigeria has made significant progress simply to be able to sustain 4 regularly scheduled popular elections in a row. During the April 12, 2003 legislative elections, about a dozen people died, but many commented that it was not as bad as it could have been. Additionally, several politicians were assassinated, including Marshal Harry, one of the leaders of Mr. Buhari's All-Nigeria People's Party. However, the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, with outside pressure, made an attempt to cleanse the electoral process when it declared almost 6 million names to be fraudulent. The names were struck from the voter rolls. On the other hand, international teams that observed the election generally concluded that the election was corrupt, with ballot boxes being vandalized, stolen, and stuffed with fraudulent votes. Some concluded the voting patterns in the South were particularly suspicious. The elections of 2007 were even worse, with national legislative and presidential races deeply flawed, as were the state and local contests. The year before the election of President Obasanjo sponsored a plan to modify the 1999 Constitution that would allow him to run for a third term of office, but the National Assembly failed to ratify it. Next, the Independent National Election Commission disqualified Vice President Abubakar from running for president, but the Supreme Court declared that the INEC had no such power. Last-minute ballots were printed and distributed to include him, but the ballots showed only party symbols, not the names of candidates, and lacked serial numbers that helped produce fraud. On Election Day, international observers, including some from the European Union and some from the United States, witnessed instances of ballot box theft, long delays in the delivery of ballots and other materials, and a shortage of ballots for the presidential race. Often there was no privacy for voters for marking their ballots in secret. Observers also witnessed unused ballots being marked and stuffed into ballot boxes. Frustrated voters erupted in protest, and the ensuing violence ended in the deaths of about 200 people. The elections of 2011. The election of 2011, however, were considered by most observers to be a big improvement over 2007, at least partly because of the reforms initiated by the INEC. Goodluck Jonathan, from the south, won almost 59% of the vote, and Muhammadu Buhari, from the north, won 32%. PDP candidates won majorities in both houses of the legislature, although the ACN, CPC, and several other parties won Senate and House seats. Flaws, such as underage voting and chaotic local counting centers, were noted, but the reforms apparently controlled the amount of fraud. Despite these changes, the election starkly exposed the ethnic and religious divide between the North and South. Mr. Jonathan did not win a single one of the 12 northernmost states, out of Nigeria's total of 36. Mr. Buhari got less than a quarter of the vote in the 20 southernmost ones. Even before the elections were tallied, youths began burning buildings in northern cities, and bombs exploded in the days that followed. Human rights groups claimed that hundreds of people were killed, and a heavily military presence and curfews in the worst-hit states of the north restored the calm. Still, the violence reflected the country's cleavages, and almost certainly resulted from discontent fed by high poverty rates in the north, leaving Nigeria's national question as open as ever. The elections of 2015. The elections were first scheduled to be held on February 14, 2015, but they were postponed to March 28, mainly due to the poor distribution of permanent voters' cards, especially in areas where people had been displaced from their homes by Boko Haram. The government also claimed that the postponement was necessary to allow time to contain the group's insurgency in several northeastern states. Critics claim that the postponement was a ploy by the incumbent president, Goodluck Jonathan, to buy time to sway support from the main opposition candidate, Muhammadu Buhari. However, Buhari won the election by more than 2.5 million votes, marking the first time an incumbent president has lost re-election in Nigeria. Buhari's party, All Progressives Congress, also picked up seats in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and Jonathan's People's Democratic Party lost seats in both houses. Boko Haram attempted to disrupt the election by attacking voting centers, killing 41 people, and an opposition politician, Yumaro Ali, was gunned down in one attack. However, the elections were generally peaceful and orderly, according to observers from the African Union, Commonwealth of Nations, Economic Community of West African States, and the European Union. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon congratulated Nigerian citizens and the government for conducting a successful and peaceful election. Interest groups. Perhaps surprisingly, interest groups have played an important role in Nigerian government and politics. Although the development of an active civil society has been hampered by prebendalism and corruption, there is an array of civil society organizations that often cooperate with political parties. Some of them are based on religion, such as the Christian Association of Nigeria, that protested loudly when Babangida decided to change Nigeria's status in the organization of the Islamic Conference from observer to member. A large number of Muslim civil society organizations in the north work to support the Sharia court system. They've had to work around military control, but citizens have sought an impact on political life through labor unions, student groups, and populist groups. Labor unions. Labor unions before the military oppression of the 1980s were independent and politically powerful. Organized labor challenged governments during both the colonial and post-colonial eras. But the Babangida regime devised methods to limit their influence. This was established through corporatism, or government-approved interest groups to provide feedback to the government. A central labor organization supplanted the older unions, and only candidates approved by Babangida could be elected as labor leaders. However, the labor movement still is alive and retains an active membership. If democracy indeed is established, labor unions could play a vital role in the policymaking process. For example, in July 2003, labor unions widely and openly protested the government's attempt to raise oil prices for Nigerian consumers. By 2007, it was clear that labor unions had regained much of their previous power when the Nigeria Labor Congress called and successfully orchestrated a general strike of workers across Nigeria. The strike was organized to protest the government's hike in fuel prices and taxes. The government agreed to rescind their hikes, but strike organizers wanted further reductions. The Nigerian government has subsidized fuel heavily, just as the Iranian government has, and in both cases the subsidies were quite expensive. Nigeria especially is under international pressure to cut the subsidies so that the immense national debt can be paid. Business interests. Business interests have tended to work in collaboration with the military regimes during the last decade and have shared the spoils of the corruption within the elite classes. However, some business associations have operated outside the realm of government influence in the private sector. Associations for manufacturers, butchers, and car rental firms are only a few groups that have organized. In the 1990s, some of these groups became a leading force in promoting economic reform in Nigeria. Human rights groups. Other interest groups have organized and promote human rights. University students, teachers, civil liberties organizations, and professional groups, doctors, lawyers, protested the abuses of Babangida and the Abacha regimes and remained active promoters of democratic reform. They staged street demonstrations and protests in 1997 and 1998 as Abacha prepared to orchestrate a campaign to succeed himself. Although the groups are now only loosely connected, their willingness to collaborate and remain active might play an important role in creating a true democracy in Nigeria. Mass media. In contrast to most less developed countries, Nigeria has long had a well-developed independent press. General Abacha moved to muffle its criticism of his rule when he closed several of the most influential and respected Nigerian newspapers and magazines in 1994. However, the tradition remains intact, although the press reflects, like so many other institutions, the ethnic divisions within the country. Most of the outspoken newspapers are in the south, although a few have been published in the north. Generals from the north have often interpreted criticisms of the press as ethnic slurs reflective of region-based stereotypes. The media actively spread news as the events of the 2007 elections unfolded, and many journalists were highly critical of the government's actions. Radio is the main source of information for most Nigerians, with newspapers and TV more common in the cities. All 36 states run their own radio stations.